Welcome to Sports and Jesus Podcast, the podcast about sports and Jesus. We are brought to you by Sound Speech Studios, and my name is David. You doing good, Joy? You good?
Oh, I'm good. You good?
Yeah, I'm good. You good? You good, Daniel?
I'm good.
Daniel's good. You good? You good, Stats?
I'm good.
Stats is good. All right, we're good. This Sports and Jesus podcast, like I said, is a podcast about sports and Jesus. We've been wanting to do a podcast for a while. Couldn't decide if we want to do a sports podcast or a podcast about Jesus and theology. And so we decided to make a podcast that would be the podcast if those two podcasts had a baby. And that's what you're listening to right now. So why are we qualified to talk about sports and Jesus? Well, I would say I'm pretty qualified to talk about sports and the fact that I've won 6 Super Bowls, 5 World Series, and 2.5 Stanley Cups. In reality, I just like to watch a lot of sports and talk about it, and I listen to a lot of sports radio. So, Joy, why are you qualified to talk about Jesus?
Well, I like Jesus. I'm definitely a fan of Jesus, and I watch a lot of Jesus.
Yeah, so I would say we are pretty qualified. So I'm David, that's Joy. We also have our producer, Sensei Dan.
What's going on?
And we have our statistician named Stats.
Hey.
And he is not with us. He's on the phone actually, so that's why he sounds like he's on the phone. So
All
Joy,
right.
how's your fantasy football team doing?
Well, the fantasy team is looking pretty good. Out of my 3, only one is good. The other 2 are terrible.
So you have 3 teams in one league?
3 different teams, 3 different leagues.
Oh. Is your good team in the league that I'm also in with you?
Yeah.
Of course.
How's your team looking?
I am actually playing a pretty tough opponent this week. It is my wife, and she is destroying me. My wife is beating me in fantasy football, which is a little bit embarrassing, and she really enjoys talking trash about it all week and until we play again, because she always beats me in fantasy football.
I think the good question is are you letting her beat her, or is she actually just beating you?
She's beating me. She's just outright beating me. So, college football started. How's your team doing? First of all, let's tell our listeners who your team is.
I'd say I'm an Alabama fan. I almost hate saying I'm an Alabama fan just because they're winning. You don't want to seem like a
Bandwagon.
Exactly. But my family would remove me from the family. That would completely disown me if I wasn't an Alabama fan. So definitely say I'm an Alabama fan.
So I guess you're pretty happy on Saturdays most of the time.
Yeah, I haven't had a rough Saturday in a while.
Yeah, I wish I knew what that felt like. I'm a Tennessee fan, and we won this week. I don't know if we're going to win again, but so we're happy right now. So speaking of college football, real quick, Joy, I was just wondering what your predictions are for the 4 teams to make it to the playoff this year.
Well, Alabama will probably get there.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say Oklahoma, especially after that win at Ohio State. And I think Clemson will get back there just because I feel like the ACC is really the only other team that would, compete against them would be Florida State, and I don't think Florida State will without DeAndre Francois. And
You said Francois really good.
I was thinking ahead of time. I was like, I got to make sure I nail that Francois.
He's a quarter French.
Quarter French. So that means one of his okay, yeah.
And then probably you at USC. I don't think many people will compete with them in the Pac-12.
So you're keeping the Big Ten out of it. By the way, that's confusing. The Big Ten has 12 teams. They might have 14 teams. I don't know. And the Big 12 has 10 teams. So who gets to decide what to name these?
It's the they that no one knows who they is, and I'm doing quotation marks for the listeners.
Yes, yeah, quotation marks. He also has a brand new, fresh haircut. He wanted to look good for our audio podcast today.
You're not going to mention the tuxedo?
Oh, yes. We are also, all four of us, me, Joy, Stats, and Dan, are all wearing tuxedos. And we smell really good, too. So we just really wanted to present our best for episode 1 of our podcast. So as you're picturing us in your mind, sitting in a castle, of course, is what we're doing, in tuxedos. So that's exactly what's happening right now, which I'm sure that's the way everybody was picturing this.
Yep. So who's your top 4?
My top 4 are Tennessee, of course. We're going to finally beat Alabama for the first time since I've been alive, actually, I think. No, I'm just kidding. No, there's no way Tennessee's going to. I'm picking Alabama. I'm picking Oklahoma also. I'm going to pick USC, and I'm going to pick Penn State. And just because I don't think neither Clemson nor Florida State is good enough to go undefeated, and I think you're going to have to go undefeated in the ACC to make it to the playoff. By the way, if you could rename the Big Ten or the Big 12, which you should never put numbers in the name of conferences, what would you name them?
I would go by colors.
Okay. What colors?
Well, I hate orange, so orange isn't in there. You have to stick with red conference,
Are there any other colors?
the white conference,
White's not a color.
black conference. I don't know. You might want to keep race out of it. So you might want to not do black or white either. So yeah, no, never mind. Let's not do colors.
Yeah, you could get into some trouble. Well, I mean, what if you're a red team in the green conference? I would call the the Pac-10 or whatever, Pac-12, I would call them the West Conference. I would call the Big Ten the North Conference. I would call the Big 12 the close to Texas Conference. I would call the Southeastern Conference the South. See, that makes sense. Like, why didn't every conference just take a cue from the SEC and call themselves directionally? But then you got the ACC, and they're kind of Southeast, too.
Yeah, and then you have, I mean, is it still in the East? Because it's kind of right in the middle.
Well, that's why it's called the Around Texas Conference.
I feel like Texas should be in the Southeastern
Or
Conference.
what if the Pac-12 took a cue from the ACC and called themselves the PCC, Pacific Coast Conference?
I'm just now learning for the first time that that's what the PAC means. I had no idea.
Wait, yeah, that is what they are called.
Pacific Atlantic Conference?
Pacific Athletic Conference. Yeah, so I just said, what if the Pac-12 called themselves what they actually called themselves? Yeah.
Nice.
Yep. So, I'm in a room with 2 Alabama fans right now. I've got a question for y'all. And Stats, if you can put this on our Twitter poll. This is, I think, one of the best sports questions I've ever heard. Okay, so let's say Bear Bryant, legendary coach of Alabama, you found out that he is actually alive and has full brain function, still at his peak, and he comes back and says, I want to be the head coach at Alabama. Do you fire Nick Saban and make Bear Bryant the coach at Alabama?
That's a negative.
So you're telling Bear Bryant, hey, your name's on the stadium, but you can't coach here.
Yeah, man. I don't want to. Let's bring some biblical terminology here. I don't want to put old wine skins in new wine. Old wine in new wine skins.
Old wineskins and new wineskins.
Yeah.
That's a good point. What about you, Joy? Are you telling Bear Bryant to his face, no, you can't coach Alabama. Go coach Virginia.
Why Virginia? Yes, I'm telling him face to face. No, you can't coach.
What happens if you got to play Virginia in the Final Four?
It would be coaching against him. It's
That's
just-
true. That is what would happen if you played Virginia in the Final Four. You would be coaching against him.
Literally against him.
Literally. That's a hard word.
But it's just a completely different game than when he was coaching. I'm not sure if he could coach successfully like he did the way football's changed.
Literally.
Literally, he is probably a little rusty.
Yeah. And his offensive system is probably a little outdated.
Yeah. Except unless you're Georgia Tech.
Yeah. That's true.
And you're not using electricity anymore.
Yeah.
Still, you're...
And you've got an Amish offense like Georgia
Yeah.
Tech. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So while we're on this topic of head coaches, again, the podcast name is Sports and Jesus, and it's about time to get into the Jesus portion of the podcast. This Jesus portion of the podcast is brought to you by the polar bears of Antarctica. And while we transition from sports to Jesus, we'll talk about a sports and Jesus story, since there's about 3 of them out there. So, for probably everybody knows at this point, but probably a month ago, maybe a couple months ago, the head football coach at the University of Mississippi, Hugh Freeze, resigned his position as head coach because it came out that he had been making regular phone calls to prostitutes, and which, whatever, but why this is a Jesus story is because Hugh Freeze had presented himself and has presented himself for years as a devout, strong Christian who would make the point to talk about God every time a microphone was put in his face. I mean, this guy, and seemed to be very sincere about the way that he talked about Jesus and about what he believed about Jesus. It was known that he would play worship music at some of the football practices, and I think wasn't even when Katy Perry was at Ole Miss, I don't think he really even knew who Katy Perry was because he mostly listens to Christian music. I mean, so this is, by all accounts on the outside, this guy seems to be a really strong Christian. And then you find out that for years he has this secret destructive sin that he has fallen into. And it finally comes out, and he's out. And many Christian haters use this as ammo to make the argument that nobody really believes this deep down. And I've seen it on Facebook, I've seen it on social media, that here's this guy that Christians for a while would point to him and say, hey, that's one of us. And he's fallen into this huge sin. So how do you... So the question I want to ask you is how can we handle those conversations? How do we handle that? What are we supposed to think about Hugh Freeze? What are we supposed... Because he's still, even post this coming out, still claims to be a Christian, just says, he's made some mistakes, fallen into some sin. And so how do you handle when celebrity Christians or Christians that are well known when they make big mistakes. Shout out to Justin Bieber.
If I was your boyfriend, I'd never let you go.
Yeah, we have Justin Bieber in the studio actually. So
And Steph Curry.
no, Steph Curry did no. Steph Curry did okay. Joy doesn't like Steph Curry because Joy likes LeBron James, and so Joy says that Steph Curry isn't a real question.
Real question.
Steph Curry is not a real Christian because of the whole throwing his mouthpiece and saying a bunch of expletives. And so Joy just put that on the same level as Hugh Freeze calling prostitutes. So no, I'm not putting Steph Curry into the same category as Hugh Freeze.
I would.
And Justin Bieber.
In my personal record book, they're the same person.
Y'all can't see the stare that I'm giving Joy right now as he talks about my favorite basketball player. But yeah. So on a serious note, so what do we do with this? Because this seems to be happening frequently, especially you hear of a lot of pastors that fall into sin. It seems to, for the most part, be often a sexual sin that they fall into. I know there's in our circles, in the last few years, there's been a pastor that was well respected, had a well known, very famous pastor as a grandfather, and he was a well known pastor himself. Wrote a few books and fell into sexual sin. So what do you let's specifically talk Hugh Freeze. We don't want to sit here and debate whether he's a Christian, whether everything he said was a lie. I mean, obviously there's some of it that sin can do that to you, to where you don't mean to lie, but just by your conduct, the stuff that you're saying doesn't carry a lot of weight to it because of the sin that you're doing in secret. And when that comes out, it takes all the air from underneath those wings of everything you've built up for years. And so we don't want to sit here and debate, whether he's a Christian, because let's be honest, Christians can fall into sin. Christians can struggle with sin. Christians fall into secret sin. Even biblically, there are two instances that come to mind of King David in the Old Testament who fell into sexual sin with Bathsheba, and then that led him to try to cover that up, which led him into more sin. That led him into kind of almost a downfall for years. But I don't think we would debate whether David believed in Yahweh or not. I also think of Peter in the New Testament, not quite as huge as kind of David's sin, but Peter, I mean, this definitely is a big deal, saying that he didn't know Jesus when he'd spent 3 years with the man. Even when Jesus just told him he was going to deny him, he turned around and denied him. So I think that Christians definitely can fall, and I think what should our response be to Hugh Freeze would be that we should love Hugh Freeze. We should love his family. We should, but at the same time, in the future, we probably shouldn't lift men up that high. I think that's where a lot of the problem, I think the fall is greater because of the way he was viewed. Do you have any thoughts on the matter?
No, I think you were right. We're so quick to just throw them under the bus, to judge them, because we held them so high, and I think it's really easy to just do that route instead of, if that happened to one of our, members of our church, we would, draw them aside and help them and love them. But when it comes to those kind of people, it's just a lot easier just to throw them under the bus and say, well, I don't think they were really a Christian. They weren't one of us, but we really need to. They're just a person that needs love instead of hate because, they're in sin. And if he still claims to be a believer, I think you really need to treat them as such and not just a famous person that was calling prostitutes.
Yeah, exactly. And we pray that Hugh Freeze is and his family, because that's the people we don't hear about as much that probably took the brunt of the pain involved in this, would be his wife and his children, and the embarrassment and the pain that comes from this. And so we should pray that hopefully he has a strong church around him that'll call him to repentance and love him and his family through that repentance that hopefully he listens to. And so talking about family and talking about Hugh Freeze, also I want to talk a little bit about marriage today. And I want to ask first, what is marriage? And in the past few weeks, there's been this Nashville statement that's come out, and it came out mostly to articulate a Christian, biblical, clear view of homosexuality and transgender. And that's kind of the purpose of it. But I think in the first article of it, and one day we'll probably talk about some of that stuff on a podcast, but we're not going to do that today. The Article 1 of the Nashville Statement, I think, gives a good kind of affirmation and denial of what marriage is. So, Joy, if you can read that for us.
Yeah. It's Article 1. It says, "We affirm that God has designed marriage to be a covenantal, sexual, procreative, lifelong union of one man and one woman as husband and wife, and is meant to signify the covenant love between Christ and his bride, the church." It says, "We deny that God has designed marriage to be a homosexual, polygamous, or polyamorous relationship. We also deny that marriage is a mere human contract rather than a covenant made before God."
Yes. So I think that's a good definition of what marriage is. And I think one thing you can overlook, especially with the rest of the Nashville Statement there, is where it says that God designed marriage to be a lifelong union. And I think that's something that the church misses at times. When I say the church, I don't mean a specific church. I think when I say the church, I really mean the church as a whole in America, and also some Christians that I see on social media. I think sometimes I see a lot of attack on things like homosexuality and transgender with a lot of vigor and a lot of zeal. But what I don't see with the same vigor and zeal is an attack on other things that destroy marriages, like premarital sex or like divorce. And I wonder why that is, and why I firmly believe that those things are just as big of a front to marriage as homosexuality and as transgender and those things and those sins. And I think the reason why is this important? Why are we choosing to do this on our first podcast? Is why are you wanting to talk about marriage? Why are you wanting to talk about what hurts marriage? I thought this was Jesus, this marriage. And so quickly I want to say why marriage issues are Jesus gospel issues. And that is because marriage is representation of the gospel and is the best earthly visible representation of the gospel. What's that verse?
Yeah, it's Ephesians 5:25. It says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish."
So there clearly marriage, the husband's love for his wife is compared to Jesus' love for the church and his people. Marriage is a big deal, and it wasn't that Paul there was thinking, okay, I want to try to explain what the gospel is. I want to try to explain how Jesus loves his people. So what can I think? Oh, I'm going to use marriage as an example. No, we firmly believe that marriage was created with the purpose of representing the gospel. That's why marriage exists. That's why God created marriage. So an attack on marriage, an attack on your marriage, an attack on my marriage, an attack on marriage as a whole is an attack on the gospel. And I think the biggest threat to marriages is a lack of understanding of the gospel. And B, I think is divorce even within the church. And so it kind of bothers me that we don't hear from a lot of pulpits, we don't see a lot of Christians attacking some of these things that are so anti-gospel. I mean, you just think about that, something that's so anti-gospel that's in a lot of churches is just accepted. And that's why, I think it's me, Joy and I, we go to the same church, and actually Sensei Dan is one of our pastors here. And one of the reasons that we love our church, and I would encourage you to find a church like this, is our church takes marriage seriously. And they don't, and when I say they take marriage seriously, I don't mean they get up there and preach against homosexuality. I mean, they really take marriage seriously. They have taken my marriage seriously. And marriage is hard. It is the hardest thing I have ever done. And everybody in here is nodding their head in agreement with me. I mean, marriage is difficult. I would not, and I don't think my wife would matter me saying that. Like, I would not still be married if I didn't believe in the gospel, if I didn't believe that it was a representation of the gospel, if that wasn't what our marriage was built upon. And my wife would say the same thing. There are times where that's what has kept us together. And I would encourage you to be a part of a church that understands that and that takes that seriously. There's been times where me and my wife have been going through some hard stuff, and the pastors at our church have come over to our house, even late at night at times, and lovingly helped us work through things because they take marriage so seriously. And that's what I would encourage those of you out there, that if you're not in a church that takes marriage seriously, you need to start rethinking some things, because that's a big deal. Marriage is a big deal. The sanctity of marriage is a big deal. Divorce is a big deal. And it discourages me that just people just flippantly talk about marriage and flippantly talk about divorce. Like, well, if it doesn't work out, then it's okay. Well, maybe she wasn't the one for me, or maybe he wasn't the one, the mythical one, as Matt Chandler calls it, for me. That doesn't exist, by the way. Hey, you want me to tell you who the one is for you? It's the one that you're married to. That's it. There's no other one for you. It's the one that you made that covenant with, that lifelong, like the Nashville Statement says, that lifelong union with. Is there anything you'd like to add on top of that, Joy?
I think you pretty much nailed it on the head, and I think you'll see people more against homosexuality and gay marriage rather than their own marriage, just because I think it's just one of those popular topics to have an opinion on, especially on social media. And I think it's just marriage is just one of those things that's just, it's just a marriage now. That's how people view it, rather than viewing it as a lifelong covenant and a representation of the gospel as the Bible teaches it.
Yeah, and quickly, just in closing, I think that is because homosexuality and struggles like that, I think most people, the majority of people that bash those things can't relate to them because they've never had that struggle. But they can relate to somebody who's frustrated in their marriage, or somebody who is struggling with lust or other things like that are also affronts to marriage. They can relate to those things, so they can sympathize with those struggles. And so they don't attack those struggles because they understand them. Whereas other struggles that they don't struggle with, they can't understand, so it becomes gross to them, or it's a new level of sin because my brain doesn't think that way, so how could somebody else's think that way unless there's just some major problems with them that I don't have.
Yeah, and I just had this thought pop in my head, but I think you can even correlate a not a biblical understanding of what sin is, because you view homosexuality as like a sin, and then you have, murder above that, but lying is underneath homosexuality. So you see homosexuality as such a gross sin because you don't understand that in God's eyes sin is equal. So homosexuality and homosexuals are just like these gross people that you just want to, they're over in this corner by themselves, but Christians are over here held above them.
Yeah.
I think those correlate.
And just to let y'all know how seriously I take marriage, I'm a licensed minister, and I've really been thinking about going down to the mall and just randomly marrying people.
Yeah,
That's
I think we just found a new sponsor.
Yeah. That's how important I think it is. But so thank you for bearing with us through episode 1 of Sports and Jesus. It is brought to you by Prevail Missions International, planting churches and building zip lines in Western Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a real sponsor.
Yeah, although we only built one zip line one time. But we really are helping plant churches. It's awesome. We'll tell you all about that
Zip lines are awesome.
See, this is God's work, Christian ministry, to make a loving son out of an enemy, to make the lame to walk and cause the blind to see. So hit them with the truth and set the captives free.
Hit 'em with the truth. 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 Truth. With the truth. With the truth. With the truth. With the truth.